Good morning. It's April 13th. I certainly intended to get this video done earlier than what I did. My apologies. I hope you've enjoyed the 2 weeks off. We've got 2 more weeks to our semester, and for the Rodney Decker Reading Koine Greek portion of that, we've got the last 2 chapters, chapter 32, which is on me-verbs, and chapter 33, which is on me-verbs that are not in the indicative mood. And so let's get underway. Me-verbs usually are at the end of a Greek 1 text. For example, in this one, chapters 32 and 33, out of the total of 33 chapters, we're leaving me-verbs until the end. Bill Mounce's Basics of Biblical Greek, chapters 34, 35, and 36 of a text that has 36 chapters. We leave me-verbs until the end. Merkel and Plummer, beginning with New Testament Greek, there are 24 chapters, and me-verbs are discussed in chapter 24. Maybe there's a pattern there. David Allen Black's Learn to Read New Testament Greek, chapter 25 out of a total of 26 chapters are on me-verbs. There is a pattern, and usually in the spring semester of a 1-year, first-year Greek program, by the time we get to this point, students' brains are beginning to be fried mush. And so usually what we do is we note that these kind of verbs exist, and as we continue on in our further studies, we'll just make the best of their existence. And so you, however, have been introduced to me-verbs from the very first of BLC in the first semester. For example, this command that you learned, anastethi, do any of you want to stand up right now? Is a me-verb. You didn't know it was, but you used it. How about stethi? Remember when somebody was given a command, peripati, and started walking around the room? The didaskalos could say, stethi, and that means stand still. It's a me-verb. Or how about this one, where maybe it was o didaskalos, maybe it was Simonides, and we could say, Simonides legi esteka. It's a me-verb. So you've been working with these all along, and perhaps you didn't know that they were a little bit different because we've been approaching from a communicative approach. So let's read a little bit of what Rodney Decker says. The difference is between lexical forms that end in omega and lexical forms that end in me. The second paragraph that's on your skin, I've highlighted this portion. It says, some, that is some teachers, spend a lot of time on the subject and try to cover the me-verbs as completely as the omega verbs. Others are content with a more general survey to enable the first-year student to identify most of them and then leave the others for future study. That's Rodney Decker who wrote this, I have come to prefer the latter approach, and I agree with Decker on that. As I've already stated, most textbooks, this one and the ones that I've taught out of previously, leave me-verbs at the very end of the entire year. And so as we continue on and spend time reading the New Testament text, we just deal with the issue at that time. Decker continues, the last sentence in this paragraph, I have, however, tried to give fairly complete listings of the forms to provide a reference source when these forms are encountered later. The textbook that you've been using, Reading Koine Greek by Rodney Decker, is a wonderful reference resource. And I suggest that the main use you should give to this book is as a reference source. So let's continue on. By far, the most common me-verbs in the New Testament and the Septuagint are 3. Didomi, istemi, tithemi. Now, I added the verbal roots off to the side. Robert Plummer said if you see a verb that just has do, whether it's delta omicron or delta omega, and if you don't know what it is, it's a pretty good chance that it is didomi, because the root of that verb is do. If you see a sta and you don't know what the verb is, there's a pretty good chance it's istemi. And if you see a the and you don't know what the form or what the verb is, there's a pretty good chance it is tithemi. By far, the three most common mi-verbs in the New Testament are these three. So learn them well. Important aspects of mi-verbs. This is found on pages 528 and 529. Number one, you must know the stems of the most common mi-verbs, and so that's what I did on the previous screen. I took a screen capture right from Decker's text, and then I added in those stems because it's important to recognize those. Very, very important. Number two, the mi-verbs use what we would call iota reduplication in the present tense form. And since the imperfect tense is built off of the present tense stem, you'll see this iota reduplication in the present tense and in the imperfect tense. That's very, very important. Number three, there are usually no connecting vowels in the mi-verb. Now, this is buried, I think it's footnote 2. You could give it a look at. Some grammar books would call mi-verbs athematic verbs, whereas the omega class verbs they would call thematic verbs. And what that means is the thematic verbs have a theme vowel, that is, a connecting vowel between the stem and the ending. The mi-verbs, or the athematic verbs, have no theme vowel or connecting vowel between the stem and the endings. So, you know that. Number four, the aorist normally uses a kappa alpha as the form marker instead of what we've seen in the omega class verbs, the sigma alpha as the sign of the aorist. That also is very important for you to remember. And number five, the A set, now I'm talking about Decker's, 4 quadrants. He's got A, B, C, D. The A set of personal endings used in the present tense on mi-verbs are slightly different from those same endings in the omega class verb. You've already seen that in the BLC stuff. For example, if the subject is third person singular, for the verb tithemi, which means I put or I place, we'd see avtos tithesi. Okay? That might seem like it's a third-person plural ending, similar to the third-person plural ending in the omega class verbs, but the third-person plural in the mi-verbs is titheasin. So slightly different. That can help you. So let's look at this chart. This is the active indicative forms of didomi. We've got a number of columns there. You've got the present tense. You can see you've got that reduplication with iota in the present tense. Didomi, didos, didosin, didomen, didote, didoasin. There's that slight variation. And so you can determine third person plural from third person singular because the third person plural has that additional syllable, didoasin. Okay? In the imperfect, notice you've got the presence of an augment. You've also got that reduplication with iota. Okay? And so you've got edidun, edidus, edidu, edidomen, edidote, edidosan, or sometimes edidon. But pay attention to that reduplication with iota, so very important. The future tense will take just the stem, the do. Notice there is no reduplication with iota there. So you've got the stem, you've got the sigma, which is a sign of the future, and you've got the endings that you are already so very familiar with. In the first aorist, remember, mi-verbs are going to have kappa alpha aorists instead of sigma alpha aorists. So you've got your augment, you've got edoka, edokas, edoken, etc., all the way down. The kappa alpha is going to point out the aorist. Now, I have put an X through the second aorist column there. If you read the accompanying text, you'll find that there are no second aorist forms of this verb in the New Testament, or even in the Septuagint. If you read Josephus or if you read Philo, which probably you won't be doing in the next 2 or 3 weeks, you will encounter those. So I just put an X through that. Notice the perfect tense then. We've got the kappa alpha there. Okay, we've got the endings kakas, ken, kamen, kate, kan, same as in the first aorist. So my question is, if you've got these forms, how are you going to distinguish between the first aorist and the perfect tense, since both of them use the same endings? Oh, yes, you're with me. In the perfect tense, we've got the standard reduplication that we've seen in the omega class. So edoka is aorist, dedoka is perfect. Edokas is aorist, dedokas is perfect, etc. It really is pretty easy. Now, let me go back to this. In the imperfect column, I have put a square around a particular verb, and I'll just be upfront and honest with you. Sometimes I mess that up. That is a second person, it is a third person singular, and sometimes I identify it as a second person singular, and I'll show you why. The form here is edidu, okay? He was giving, or she was giving. And the reason that sometimes I have difficulty with that is because that's like the second person singular ending of the imperfect the imperfect middle passive, verbs in the omega class verbs. You can see in that third little line there, the endings we're talking about are omen ou eto, omethe este ondo, and since most of my study of Greek life, I've been approaching it from a grammar translation method. I'm a recent convert. I see that oo ending. Oh, second person singular. Oh, wait a minute. Then I remind myself that it's a me verb. And so I'll say to myself, it's a me verb. It's third person singular, you dummy, not second. Now, I would not call you, my students, dummy. I do address myself sometimes along those lines. Remember when we started the BLC stuff last August? I guess actually the grad course started it a little bit later. There was a comment about be willing to make lots of mistakes, make 10,000 mistakes. And I share this part with you so that you'll know that, hey, after all these years, I still find myself making mistakes. So be encouraged. I can read Greek fairly well, but sometimes I make mistakes. Middle indicative forms of didomi, you can see the same thing. You've got the ome, ose, that o is part of the stem. It's not a connecting vowel. So we've got some of the same endings. In the imperfect, they're slightly different. Second aorist, I didn't put an X through this, but you might as well. The future looks exactly as we would think it should. And the perfect middle and passive forms have reduplication, as is common in the perfect tense, and the same kind of endings that we're already familiar with. We move to the passive indicative forms. We've got the aorist passive, and we've got edothen, edothes, edothe, exactly the same forms that we would expect. And of course, the future passive is built off of the aorist passive stem, You already know that. Do you remember that? And so the future passive forms with the theta, eta, sigma, theta, eta will be the sign of the aorist passive, theta, eta, sigma of the future passive with the endings that we would expect. And of course, this little note says, I'm quoting Decker, of all the forms of didomi shown here, dothesete is by far the most common in the New Testament. And of course, that would mean it will be given, being a future passive. It will be given. This chart shows compound forms of verbs built off of these three most common. You can see the frequency of those verbs in the New Testament and also in the Septuagint, and you'll just recognize these verbs. We've already used many of these verbs in our BLC stuff, so that should not be a problem for you. One more thing I want to say about this chapter. In this chapter, there are some verbs which, when used transitively, mean one thing, and when used intransitively, mean another thing. And so for the quiz purposes of the vocab from chapter 32, I want you to be aware of both of those meanings, okay? The three verbs that are used this way in our vocab this chapter are istemi and a couple additional forms that are compound forms built off of that, anistemi and paristemi. And so pay attention to that as you prepare for the vocab quiz. Anyway, this is the next to the last week of our semester. Can anybody say, yes? It's been difficult. It's been real, but it's been so good. So blessings on you as we get ready to head down the home stretch of this semester. I look forward to seeing you in our Zoom conference next week.